Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of Jams and Tea on Film, where your favorite members of the Jams and Tea podcast and the related family of the Jams and Tea podcast come on here and we talk about movies, specifically movies that lots of people are talking about right now. And today we are going to be talking about the latest cinematic sensation, The Batman. And of course, we are joined today by friends of the podcast, Luke and Zach, of course, and myself and Morgan. And we are going to be talking about Batman. So let's establish a bit of a precedent here. Batman, comic book, like the biggest first comic book movie thing in 1989 with Tim Burton's adaptation back then, which is sort of a I think that movie's seen as sort of a classic by the public at large. I wouldn't necessarily say that anybody here is a massive fan of that movie, but it's what's important though is that sort of set its own precedent for comic book films at the time. It was like the biggest movie in the world then. It made a shitload of money, and then Tim Burton got to make the sequel. He got to make Batman Returns, which is it's a fucking whack ass movie. Really more of a Tim Burton movie than a Batman movie, even though I know that I prefer that movie to the first one. I know that Zach, you are a huge fan of Returns, basically for
Yes.
for reasons that exist kind of externally to it as a Batman story.
I think the biggest relationship to the character of Batman and as an adaptation of Batman that I would try to like tease out of my love of that movie is something that it shares with the first one, which is that the art direction and set design, which realize Gotham City in those movies, is, I would say, like, even to the present day, like, there's really nothing that looks quite like them. And the movies that come after them, the Schumacher movies, kind of take after them in that same way. And they just have this kind of stylized expressionism that kind of looks like the background art of a comic book panel in a way that, that's just kind of lost in the sauce of what we would consider as modern audiences comic book movies, because most of them are action movies that are set on city streets that are, Spider-Man swinging through Manhattan, whereas this takes place in like really clearly fantastical setting. That's always been really captivating to me about both of those movies, but particularly Returns.
I think it's interesting too that like Batman as like a comic book movie has really never adhered to the template of other similar movies. It's always just kind of been like Batman and kind of a riff on Batman with something else. It's like you have Burton doing like the first movie. There's a lot of like journalism and like crime subplots in that movie that take up the vast majority of it. It doesn't really feel explicitly like a Batman story. And then Returns is really more about everything that happens around. It's a Gotham movie. It's not really explicitly like Batman related. And then you have the Schumacher movies, Batman Returns and Batman Forever, which, you bring on Joel Schumacher, those movies in hindsight, they have a lot of hate towards them, but simultaneously there's a bit of a resurgence of people who kind of like a sort of cult following just because of the colorful expressionism that they kind of build upon that and the kind of wacky, campy stuff that's really more in line with the original Adam West Batman. And I don't think that anybody here, like, I think that everybody kind of universally agrees these days that the hate for a movie like Batman and Robin, and even Batman Forever, is just kind of overblown and a bit like silly, even if I don't particularly like love those movies.
I wouldn't even say I like them.
Yeah,
really.
Me either.
I mean, like, the best thing about Batman Forever is that Nicole Kidman has literally never been hotter. I can't tell you a thing about her character, but she's in it. And Batman and Robin is like, it's almost like a showgirls experience to some degree.
Yeah.
Like Paul Verhoeven's Showgirls. I don't like Batman and Robin nearly as much as that movie for a variety of reasons. But like, even if I did dislike it, who has the fucking time to hate Joel Schumacher's Batman movies anymore?
I think I would probably be the biggest Batman and Robin appreciator here because I've seen that movie since I was like really little, but also just because it's one of those things that it is not good from the perspective of like what Batman was probably established as before in terms of like where it was going, but it is for me, just consistently entertaining. And I think I could quote at least 3/4 of that film with my brother, and he would respond with like the next line.
Yeah.
Like,
I
fucking, yeah.
I have seen that movie probably 50 times.
It's a cable TV staple.
Yeah.
I feel like we're just that old enough to be like, we are
Never leave the cave without it.
like we grew
We
up in a
killed the
weird time that I
dinosaurs.
think most
The
kids
Ice
now,
Age!
I sound so fucking old when I say
Didn't.
this, but like most kids
Didn't,
now,
Arnold.
or like even teenagers, like they've kind of always been with the streaming era. So I feel like a lot of movies like Batman and Robin that just kind of get shown to you through cultural osmosis, just the fact that they're just sort of omnipresent, they're on TV. A lot, like some people might be like lost to that, or even the exposure of the Burton movies. Like I didn't own any of the Batman movies, but I've seen those first 4 like a billion times over the years. So
And I can attest to that also.
Yeah.
I can actually attest to that because, like, funny enough, I first watched Batman and Robin on Cartoon Network, which, you know, when I was younger,
Yeah.
was like, why is there a live action movie on this channel? But like, yeah, it was like through that TV like surgence and like showings of it was where I kind of got exposed to it.
I think
Yeah.
that's something that sort of unifies the Burton and Schumacher movies, those first 4 entries, is that they have a really tough task of trying to sell Batman to a much wider audience than the comic book or the animated series are built to reach, because that's how movies are. And they did so by kind of hearkening to, as you've already mentioned, the Adam West variant. But I think that they also are knowingly self-deprecating. The Tim Burton movies in a sly way, and the Schumacher movies in a really hurt way. And I think that what turns people off about particularly the Schumacher movies, but really all 4 of them, is that it kind of feels like all 4 of them sort of feel like they mock you. If at any point you go, yeah, but what about this? Like, it feels like they're thumbing their nose at you at any given point for trying to take them seriously on any terms other than kind of entertainment value, humor, aesthetic, sex appeal, as the case may be, movie to movie. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I think that what it leads to is that just none of those really feel like an adaptation that grabbed the Batman comic book, read it, and said, you know, I understood what the writer of this story, whether it's Laib or Morrison or Miller, whoever's writing the story, they're not really getting at the psychology of what Batman is, or the kind of, how do you put it? Like, everybody likes to use this term grittiness. Like, I'm building to the Nolan thing, obviously, but it's not just grit.
I think that it's definitely like the Nolan like building to that is definitely like necessary for like the cultural conversation of Batman at large. But I also think that in between Schumacher and in between Batman Begins, you have what I think many people consider to be the definitive incarnation of not just like, you know, filmic Batman, but just Batman in general and Batman the Animated Series, which is an incarnation of the show that I think balances all of the things that everything that came before it, because it takes the stylization of the Burton movies as seriously by trying to really like emphasize that sort of Bruce Timm kind of aesthetic, while also still managing to maintain like the seriousness and the psychology, and like it doesn't shy away from some of the campier elements and moments, but like as a whole it feels like that was sort of the version of Batman that I think everybody kind of looks back on from that sort of pre-Nolan era and being like, yeah, that was the, pun intended, I guess, Batman of that era, which sort of leads to Nolan.
Well, I mean, it's like the non-comic Batman for like just not even of that era, just period.
Yeah.
If you're looking for a representation of that character and you're not necessarily all that interested in comics, but you want to know Batman, I would point this hypothetical person towards the animated series, and after a good few episodes of that, Mask of the Phantasm, which is still the best Batman movie, live action, animated, whatever. If you disagree, you're wrong. I'm kidding, but you know, am I? For a while, it was like a sort of relic of the 90s and the animated series time frame. And then with time and eventual reappraisal, everyone who is in the know about this character is kind of like, oh, this is it. the translation of this.
And I think that's why people were ready to accept
short.
that darker version of Batman, is because they knew that was like that potential had already been fulfilled. And I mean, like, Mask of the Phantasm didn't make a whole lot of money, but you had people like Roger Ebert at the time coming out and saying that it was the best Batman movie. So there's a large group of people already that like were ready to take this character more seriously.
Particularly when you consider that Batman Begins was coming out around 10 years after the animated series stopped airing. So like the people that were watching that show when it was in syndication are now, young adults. And I assume most of them have an appreciation for this character and this world, and they kind of want to see it with as little strings attached as possible, because, Mask of the Phantasm is one of my favorite movies of all time, like top 20. And it's still like 85 minutes long when it should easily be an hour longer. And as great as the animation is, it could always use a bit more detail, like just more cash thrown these people's way is really the whole thing. And I think people wanted that by the time that Batman Begins rolled around, and that's more or less what they got.
I think there's a couple notes that kind of dot this transition that exist a little outside of Batman. One of them actually is just kind of one of my favorite what ifs, was that Darren Aronofsky was originally going to be the one to have the kind of fifth Batman movie after Schumacher, and it was going to be an adaptation of Year One, which is such a fascinating, like, what the fuck would that movie have looked like or been like? I would watch it. Don't get me wrong. But obviously that didn't pan.
Matthew Libatique, Batman, Burr.
I mean,
objectively, that bit, that man cooks, but like, it just gives me real like Fukunaga's Draft of It vibes.
Morgan, I think that reaction is important because come 2004, 2005, when people know this movie's coming out, I bet that was a lot of people's reaction to someone like Christopher Nolan getting a hold of Batman, because the precedent for him was like, we know him for making Interstellar and Dunkirk and all these other movies.
He had made Insomnia and Memento. He hadn't even made The Prestige yet. Like, Prestige happened between Begins and The Dark Knight. I think the other thing that's really important, you have to switch studios and comic publication companies, but the Bryan Singer X-Men movies, X-Men and X-Men 2, I think set a major precedent for the tone that you could achieve in a superhero movie. Obviously, the Raimi Spider-Man movies are also really important for establishing the kind of blockbuster, like, no shit, 2000s, you can make a lot of money doing this also. But I think those X-Men movies really laid track for, like, how Nolan would approach Begins from a tonal perspective.
It's also worth mentioning how important the Blade trilogy is in the development of these Nolan films, but particularly from the fact that David S. Goyer was a writer on all three of those and directed the third one. That's, say about that what you will.
I didn't even know about that.
But
he may have been a little bit of a liability.
Well, yeah. But he was a writer on Begins and The Dark Knight as well. And that's certainly worth noting in terms of the progression of these things.
I don't know like what the initial response to like Nolan being director is, but I think at least it would have been interesting to hear about that because of the fact that like before making Batman, like most of the stuff he made were kind of just like noir films, like kind of neo-noir
as someone who was a teenager at the time, none of us knew who the fuck Christopher Nolan was. Like I had seen Memento and I did not know who Christopher Nolan was, if that makes any sort of sense. Like there was no connection to me that like this was the guy. This was the movie that like made people aware of him, and then The Prestige was the one that kind of set it off, and then obviously The Dark Knight after that took it further, and Inception after that took it further. So this is kind of like, at least to me, obviously Memento is like a kind of a cult classic, but this is like the catalyst to the IMAX era of Nolan, and it shows in that the action set piece filmmaking is pretty whack. I love Batman Begins in spite of all the ways that it's a mess.
Well, I think like the action hand-to-hand combat sequences are rough, when the tumbler's going over the fucking rooftops, I'm hooting,
pretty litty,
hollering, howling, all three in the same cup.
Like I said,
So,
that 2005
yeah.
was a long time ago. Like, this movie's aged so fucking well. They look great.
I love the way that it looks. Yeah, it's a movie that probably it almost feels like a reaction to the Schumacher Batman films, in the sense that it veers probably farther into realism than even that like hypothetical Aronofsky would have, where it is like everything about this feels like, no, I mean, like, this Gotham City exists in the world, and that's sort of that becomes a complicating factor as these movies go along to me. Like, it's just kind of a series where like Batman is a counter-terrorist, like Gotham is under constantly being
Batmobile
besieged
is
by
a
people who want
tank.
to
Like,
he's Jack Bauer, like
Chicago, I mean Gotham.
they were also made really far apart from each other, which I think leads to the fact that like I don't think that, like, generally speaking, there's been kind of so much space in between the Nolan movies, and now that there's been kind of room for the inevitable pop culture backlash against them. And I'm not even really saying that it's totally unwarranted. I have my issues with all three movies, but I still hold a really genuine appreciation and love for like basically all of them. Even if I think that they go as far as to be disparate with each other. I think the biggest issue of like the Batman Begins, the Dark Knight comparison is just that the setting and like visual aesthetic is so divorced from each other, even though individually I think the movies make good use of what it is. Because The Dark Knight is, again, as has been said by many people over and over again, it's a Michael Mann pastiche, honestly. It's like it takes place in Chicago Gotham because that's the kind of city that would hold a story like a Michael Mann movie. And you have the Joker being Pacino and you have Bale being De Niro. And like The Dark Knight's this huge, big landmark movie. It's a really long movie. It really got all this acclaim. Heath Ledger won the Oscar for it, and he's got this legendary performance. And I think there are totally qualms to be had with it. I think that there's lots of little individual screenwriting A/B quirks, but I really just think the directing, pacing, and like overall the just how that movie flows from one scene to another can occasionally be clunky, but it's never not compelling to me, which is not a benefit that The Dark Knight Rises has. But
well, let's cross that bridge when we get to it. So the way I think of The Dark Knight at this point in time is it is a series of almost vignettes of these things happening at this one time in Gotham City, where the Joker pretty much brings the city to its knees. Each segment of this, you have the Bat Pod semi truck chase through the streets, the ferry scene, Commissioner Loeb getting poisoned. These are all just like blocks of things that happen to such a degree that they almost feel kind of loosely connected. But the thing is that each one of them taken on their own fucking owns. So it's hard to be all that mad, but the connective tissue of that movie, and particularly the connective tissue in relation to Batman Begins, is sketchy.
Honestly, for me, I think out of the two, I think I prefer Begins just a little bit more because I like the way that the origin is presented in a way that's like a lot more different from like how the other ones tried to go about it. Because like, I mean, for one thing, like when I first watched it, I didn't know anything about the Ra's al Ghul and like that sort of side of Batman at all. And I found that to be kind of compelling. And I also just found interesting that like, when I first saw it, it was quite a few years after it came out, and after a few years after The Dark Knight came out, but I was sort of like fascinated by the fact that like what was a Batman movie like visually in terms of like some choices didn't entirely seem like Batman until he dons the cape and cowl, but like he's in like a prison in like another country and he's like traveling the mountains, and it's like a very different, not just like realistic tone, but just like different locations that are not just Gotham, that I found kind of interesting in that element. But yeah, though the action cinematography and coverage and editing is like very whack. I will have to strongly agree on that one. But
and that's the thing about
yeah.
The Dark Knight is all of that. It's way better, almost at the sacrifice, seemingly for some reason, of a cohesion with the film previous. Because you look at Gotham and The Dark Knight, and it's not even attempting to be the same city. I can't believe we all looked past that at release as someone who still adores the film.
The recast of one of the major characters also did not help the cohesion of that. It's like you had Katie Holmes switching to Maggie Gyllenhaal over the span of that many years.
Well, I don't care about that because Katie Holmes fucking sucks. But
fair. Maggie Gyllenhaal is definitely better.
But you know, it's like it's just Chicago, man. I don't understand why you had to sacrifice the identity of Gotham and the Narrows and shit like that. And I like, you know, it's partially destroyed at the end of Begin or whatever. I don't understand the sort of left turn that it took from that position. And then Rises is even further away from that. Why the fuck would you shoot a movie in Pittsburgh?
Well, it's weird too because Rises is like the plot of it. Once you really get into the weeds of Rises, is that it's just Batman Begins again, but without the aesthetic. So it's even like more jarring, and you're just kind of like, wait a minute, what?
I think that what Begins gives me that maybe the other two don't, and I'm kind of like, I slightly prefer Begins to The Dark Knight. I like them about the same. Begins gets you that almost no other Batman until this year gives you, other than Mask of the Phantasm, is a balance between a tone that like takes the material seriously, is like here to treat the material like it's a story, while also having like freak shit going on, while having like weird toxin ninjas like just weird shit.
The fucking horse that breathes fire with the fear toxin at the end.
I'm telling you, I was like 13 when I saw that movie, and the horse breathing fire, I was like, it's the coolest fucking thing I've ever seen in my life.
Dope. It's so cool.
I think that particularly when I think about The Dark Knight, that came out the same year as Iron Man, which was like the first MCU movie that was the Paramount years. But the tone of that is like so much more like kind of comedic. And then that same year is Hellboy 2, which is one of my favorite comic book movies. Del Toro, again, let's go. When I watch that movie, it is a marriage of Del Toro and Mignola in a way that like, just no Batman has ever had, other than Burton, who didn't marry them very successfully.
No.
Like, he made a cool movie that I like a lot, but like just it feels like I've always been waiting for that movie. And then we got farther away from it with The Dark Knight, and then even farther away with The Dark Knight Rises. Like they just both kind of feel like counterterrorism, crime thriller.
They're Christopher Nolan movies. Like that's the thing.
Definitely.
Is that the reason that this is such an important thing to talk about is because the identity of both visual and like thematic identity of Gotham and Gotham City, and the synergy between the creator and the concept of Batman have always been a little bit at odds with each other, depending on like we each show a general amount of affinity for one of the incarnations of Batman or another that we've talked about so far. But the one thing we can all agree on is that the synergy hasn't been there yet. Like even at its most successful, Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, which I think are, you know, you can have whatever thoughts about those movies that you do, but I think that undeniably what makes Batman Begins strong is that Christopher Nolan is the closest at capturing what a live action Batman should be. He doesn't quite
Nolan, Goyer, and Jonathan Nolan, right?
Yeah.
Like the couple of screenwriters.
And
there's sort of like weird fragmentary take on the origin is, you know,
and the
thoughtful.
Spirit is kind of there, but then with The Dark Knight Rises, which we should mention is probably a movie that was very far removed from what it was originally going to be, just because of production woes, the time between The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, and because of Heath Ledger dying. There was probably a lot of things that were shifted around for that movie. But I think that's a movie that definitely, like, that's way more Christopher Nolan movie than it is a Batman movie to me, because like the ethos just doesn't match up. Like in The Dark Knight, there's still very much, you have that ending speech with Jim Gordon and the whole Two-Face ending, and it's like that gets to something about the character that I think is truly like honest and compelling to the source material of something like The Long Halloween. Whereas The Dark Knight Rises is very much just like, this is a superhero story by Christopher Nolan, and the superhero happens to look like Batman. But there are parts that are good in that movie, but it doesn't marry anything in the way that you might want as a fan. And kind of everything in between post Dark Knight Rises and now is like, even if you are someone who is particularly fond of Ben Affleck's incarnation of the character, the best he got was half a movie.
Why?
Well, that's the thing, is that you get Batman v Superman, which is like, that's the next Batman movie, and it's like, it's a version of Batman that you can argue all day how honest it is to the character, which version of the comics that that particular story and that particular Batman are drawing from. But the point is that is a version of Batman that is purposefully removed from the core of what Batman is. That is supposed to be the Dark Knight Returns Batman, which is Batman in like a worst case scenario, and Snyder also putting his very, masculine thing on that whole kind of like, and him being in the Justice League movies and that all that stuff is just like, it doesn't have much to do with Batman at all.
Imagine if Ryan Coogler had never made Black Panther, and the only exposure to T'Challa that we've had would be Civil War and
Yes,
Infinity War. And like, that was Black Panther. That would not feel like an incarnation of Black Panther without, like, it's not just about necessarily having a solo movie, but it is about having an idea written about it. I've been thinking this since seeing the new one. It feels like Affleck has just been erased from my memory.
yeah,
Not specifically because I dislike him, although I do, but because he never had his own story. He was an antagonist in a Superman movie, and then he was the protagonist of 2 Justice League movies that I did not like.
He's a different person in either Justice League. Like, he has this whole change of heart at the end of Batman vs Superman. But we like the person who resembled Batman in those movies anyway clearly died a long time before that. And so like the person that we're seeing after feels like the version that they were actually trying to do. And the way that those films were made was so fragmented and stupid that like it just doesn't feel like anything.
Just there's nothing definitive about the incarnation. Like, those movies have their fans and everything, but the point that we're getting at here is that did not do anything to nail down, like, as you could give all of those movies 5 stars, and I don't think you could honestly look me in the eye and tell me that is not Zack Snyder's Batman. That's not Batman. It's a version that someone wanted. It's like, it's a riff on the character. Nobody has really come out and been like, I'm not going to do it, but like the way I would do it, but I'm going to deliver an incarnation of this character that is true to why people love the character, which is how we get to the Batman.
Also, might I just add quickly onto that? I think I am also in agreement of Ben Affleck Batman probably being the worst Batman, mainly just because there were many moments while watching him in full suit where I was like, oh shit, right, yeah, that's Batman. I forgot. Sorry.
This fucking pretender to
continue
the throne.
on.
That's the thing about that really sets up for what talking about the Batman is that it's really funny that all the way back to 89 Batman, whenever the person who was announced to play Batman was getting announced to play Batman, everyone hated the idea. Michael Keaton was supposed to be Batman and everybody was like, this is going to suck. And then everybody was like, oh, he's great. And then the same thing happened with everyone afterwards. Like Christian Bale comes along. It's like, that guy from like indie movies or whatever, he can't be Batman. He's got to be all bulky and shit. And then he came in and it's just like, I'm Batman. And then the same thing with Ben Affleck is that like, he still got his fans. And lo and behold, when of course you get the Twilight guy to be Bruce Wayne / Batman, you have a litany of people online who are going to be like, he can't act, blah, blah, blah. Because, they don't watch Josh and Benny Safdie movies. They don't watch David Cronenberg.
3 MCU movie Twitter year is wild. And
yeah, like they're just like, he can't act, blah, blah, blah. And meanwhile, you have the four people like us who are, you know, fucking weirdos. And we've seen these movies, and it's just like, not only can he play Bruce Wayne in Batman, he has played Bruce Wayne in Batman. He's played people like this and shit like Cosmopolis. Like, we know he can do this. And you have Matt Reeves join, who has made one of the best blockbuster trilogies in the past 10 years, which is the Planet of the Apes trilogy of movies, which I'm a pretty big fan of. I think those are just really, really rock solid movies. And a guy who clearly came out the gate being like, this is what I want to do, this is what I love, and this is what I want to deliver. Like, his groundswell of hype came from the fact that he was like really excited to be doing this, and he like announced all the casting decisions on Twitter and was just like, Jeffrey Wright's gonna be Gordon, fucking John Turturro's gonna be fucking Carmine Falcone, and like all this shit, and it's like Zoe Kravitz's gonna be Catwoman, and everyone was like, oh my god, this is gonna rule. And like there was sort of a like there was sort of like an unspoken kind of just vibe that radiated off of the production of this that just felt different to me. And I feel like seeing the movie just sort of doubles down on the fact that it's like, yeah, it was different. It was because it was fucking Batman.
Like in 2018, 2019 or something, I remember seeing the announcements that was being filmed in London and like doing the fucking Banderas, like like, because Gotham is Victorian London with electronic billboards. That's the thing.
Gotham. It has the word goth in it. Gothic.
So I was literally like, I saw that and I was like, he sees it. He's beginning to believe.
He's fighting off Christopher Nolan one-armed.
Zack Snyder with the other, just like. And that's the thing, is that like, I think above all else is that Matt Reeves is clearly a fan, because like, I say this in the nicest way possible. When he announced that cast, it's just like, this is like a member of film Twitter fan casting Batman.
Yeah.
And that's precisely why.
Zoe Kravitz and Jeffrey Wright are like, and Robert Pattinson too. It's like all of it. Yeah, you're like top to bottom.
And Paul Dano. You're like, Paul Dano is such a film Twitter cast. Like, I mean, come on. It's just so like,
that's like a guy who saw Prisoners one time and was like, he should play the Riddler.
I remember seeing that announcement and doing the fucking Riddler noise of like, oh.
It was supposed to go like this.
This is exactly how this was supposed to go.
So I think the other big thing before the Batman came out that really kind of, you know, rustled everybody's jimmies was the runtime. Because a lot of times when big movies like this come out, the runtime will be leaked like 6 months beforehand, and it's like a rough cut, and everyone's like, oh my God, this movie's going to be 3 hours long. And then it never ends up being 3 hours long. And then that never got debunked with the Batman. And it turns out that, yeah, it was actually 2 hours and like 56 minutes long. And so that caused some trepidation. But however, with me, who is kind of like bought hook, line, and sinker by all of the things that we had known so far, I was just like, well, first of all of the good Batman movies in live action have been 2 hours and 20 minutes bare minimum. So, I mean, there's not a precedent for this. But also I was just like, okay, so this is actually going to take some time and really like world build then. And that's what I think the baseline great thing about the Batman is that we spent a lot of time talking about the different versions of Gotham, about how, like, you know, Tim Burton kind of had the right idea, but it's just sort of like, it's like good Gotham, kind of whatever everything else. And then there's like the Schumacher Gotham, which is just like a cartoon. And then there's the Nolan Gotham, which is cool in one movie and then Chicago in the other. And then there's Snyder, which...
Do you remember Snyder's Gotham? Me neither.
Yeah, exactly.
Was there one?
I mean, it's fucking New York.
There were like two scenes
in the Suicide Squad, I think.
Yeah,
like Batman.
And like they were all.
That's like a David Ayer movie. I don't know.
Like they were all like at night, and they just looked like a fucking city with buildings. And Jim Gordon was there in one scene.
Now we get the, pun intended, Gotham City. In my opinion, the like opening of the Batman is great because it's sort of like, it shows Bruce before it, like he's putting on his costume actively, but it's got that montage, it's got that fucking Travis Bickle taxi driver monologue in the background, and it's just like Gotham is a city where it's always raining. It looks like shit. The fact that there are electronic billboards in it almost looks out of place because everything looks fucking ancient. And it's like, yes, exactly. You get it. This is a place that is like modern only through the fact that there are just people there. It looks old, it looks dirty, it looks grimy, and it's covered in shadows. It's covered in just like all kinds of really believable, like it just looks weathered, and that kind of identity of being this sort of like, it does take what worked about the Nolan Gotham, but I think sort of doubles down on it, is because you don't have the contrast of like when Batman is training in China and flashbacks and stuff, and then cutting back to Gotham, is that this is just Gotham, and it just fully immerses you in it from the first frame onward.
Honestly, like, I think that production design and visual look element is pretty key, because it's like, it's not just, oh, it looks cool. Like, it's basically embedded into like the themes of the movie, where it's like everyone is occupying and living in their normal lives and essentially like infrastructure that is like on the verge of collapsing, which that is the essence of Gotham in a nutshell, I think.
To tie back into a weird anecdote, is that this is the production designer of not only the Avengers, but of The Fountain and Requiem for a Dream. Aronofsky. I mean, there he is. And you know what, though, is the most important production design work this person has done that is going to make everybody go, it was the fucking production designer for the 25th Hour.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
yeah, that's hot.
Oh,
that makes sense.
I think that, so we've kind of talked about the environment of Gotham and how it's been treated in these different movies. It may do to just kind of tease that out a little bit, because I think that Luke has already talked about like why this movie's environment is important to the movie. And it's just that there is an essential relationship between Batman and all of the characters of Batman, not just Bruce Wayne, but like all of the characters and their setting. That is true of basically like every DC superhero. I'm kind of cribbing this from a friend of mine, kind of has like a relationship to their area, to their little locale, like a Greek god or a demigod or a hero, where they're sort of like the protector over this one space.
Superman in Metropolis, that is the case Wonder Woman with Themyscira.
And then taking that further, it is the way that a film, which essentially through not just like sets and production design, but just by the nature of the way that a camera works, they are about the places where they are filmed. And thus that's why filming in London is important, because it establishes the relationship between an actor as a character and like where they are in space. And thus it's just kind of like, it's the point where movies and Batman overlap as creative entities. And so it's really quite vital to get the environment right. And I think that this movie does a great job of not just getting the aesthetic of it right, but making it feel really spatial. And it uses the runtime in a way so that the way that scenes are structured in their duration give you the sense, and what characters are doing, especially with Bruce and his little backpack and all that kind of thing, where it's like, it's about how it takes a certain amount of time to get from the Batcave to the Penguins Club to this orphanage to this place. They're all in different parts of the city. And as you move from point A to point B, that's how you run into new characters, new scenarios, like to the point that, and I think a lot of people have pointed out the similarities in production design between this film and the Arkham series of video games, but it specifically feels applied in the same way that it would be applied in the video games, where it says you have an objective, go to that objective, and when you go there, new stuff happens. And that's how all movies work a bit, but there's almost no sense of spatial reality when I'm watching The Dark Knight. It's a series of events, whereas
everybody has fast traveled everywhere.
Yeah.
To get to the next most dramatic scene, whereas this feels like a closed ecosystem, which is hugely vital to its themes and its meanings, as Luke has already said.
I mean, not to like stick to the game comparison here, but the two things it reminds me of immediately is something that really understood the way like travel and like sort of continuity between locations was the early seasons of Game of Thrones. in my opinion, is that show is really like focused on the tangibility of where things are. And then the second half of the show throws it out altogether. But the other thing is
they're here the next day.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, oh, and they're gone. And the cool thing though, is like the Arkham series video games is an obvious point of inspiration for, obvious reasons. But the thing that it reminds me of is Deus Ex Mankind Divided, is because that is a video game that is like the actual amount of video game it's like a couple city blocks, but you can explore every inch of those city blocks. There's no walls or limitations that it gives you on this really well-defined spatial environment. It's really focused on creating, Gotham isn't a city in this movie. Gotham's an ecosystem. When something happens in one scene, you feel the repercussions happen elsewhere with other characters, just because you have the sort of the unspoken narrative of, the Penguin clearly being some guy who's, he's like an up and coming crime boss, but he clearly doesn't hold as much sway as someone like Falcone. But that's sort of the unspoken narrative that leads them to sort of the one of the kind of climactic moments where they kind of turn on each other. And it's like you sort of feel this happening in the background without it actually being explicitly said. So whenever there is a scene, there's always more than one thing happening. You can feel something else going on. Like whenever they are uncovering something based off of the Riddler mystery, you can feel Paul Dano in the background plotting ahead of them. So there's never just one layer to a given scene. You're always understanding that everything is constantly in motion.
It lends this really spectacular tangibility to it that I didn't say anything about the Burton films when we were sort of introing this. I think the 89 one kind of sucks. I'm not going to linger on that. I think Returns is like a really grand, almost impressionistic at times Gotham tapestry that is really cool to watch, but that I don't get a whole lot out of. Beyond that, those are like the strongest representations of Gotham City to me in a film, and even those feel like compromises.
They're a little two-dimensional. They feel like the backgrounds of Metropolis or the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. They're using movie two-dimensionality to replicate comic panel two-dimensionality, which is like cool, but it doesn't necessarily give you that three-dimensional, like you could walk in here and watch a drug deal go down and you turn over there and it's like, oh, that's Wayne Enterprises. There's an environmental awareness to Batman Begins. There's a set piece that happens because there's like an elevated train that runs to the tower in the center of the city, and the geography of the city is like relevant to the film. And this is the first time since then that I felt like that's true.
I do like that point about like kind of the geography and sort of how it influences action, though, because I think like there were definitely sort of like in a similar way like a lot of set pieces that sort of influenced it, but I also think like there's certain things where it's like like they're places that have character even though they aren't super important. Like what kind of scene is going to go down in it, like that construction area where like they always meet up and sort of is later invaded by like Catwoman and that sort of thing. And it could just be like any sort of construction building, but like the way that they have it set up is like, oh, it's very much like an outlook of the entire city and sort of like what that says about why they meet up there and that sort of thing. So there's always like a lot of purpose and just not just the way it looks, but as you're saying, kind of like the placement of it in relation to everything else.
In terms of comic books and what Reeves chose to translate, is I was most strongly reminded of environmentally of Scott Snyder's work on Batman and primarily the Court of Owls, where it definitely has that really strong Burton-esque animated series gothic looming, like everything has a flying buttress or whatever type of thing. But it also, like, you get down on the street level and you're looking at the scene of a crime and you're like, fuck, somebody get me out of here. This place sucks. And like, that is really important. Like, paving the way for this film to never have to lay a really heavy exposition dump or monologue on you about how the night is always darkest before the dawn. I keep taking shots at the Dark Knight in this, and like, I swear to God, I love that movie. But I
me
like,
too.
I'm also sort of relishing in the fact that I no longer have to defend it to my dying breath because I now have this. The environment speaks for itself, and it speaks through the characters. And I think really this is why this, to me, is the best live action Batman film, is because you see in every sense that Bruce Wayne and Batman are products of this environment in the exact same way that every other character in the film is a product of this environment, in the way that defines, as we were talking about, literally every comic book villain or character that happens to be set in Gotham City or whatever their respective habitat happens to be. And this is really a key thing that I think has not just been lost in the last handful of movies with Batman in them in terms of live action, but with comic book movies in general, as people make the scale of things larger, you know, for like, New York seems to become less important to Spider-Man, for instance, and that seems entirely antithetical to Spider-Man to me, much in the way that like drastically changing Batman's environment would. Like, it's part of why I struggle with Justice League to begin with, like just as a concept. Because like, if Batman's, what the fuck is Batman doing outside of Gotham? Go back to your hole, Bruce. Like I'm just inherently less invested because everything feels less personal for that kind of hero most of the time, and everything here feels personal for Bruce, even when it doesn't directly tie into his lineage, and especially when it does.
Also, something that was sort of mentioned kind of before in terms of like scale, and Jake, you kind of mentioned the duration before, which I think is like a very good point to bring up, is like, I think all of those elements would not have been emphasized as well if it wasn't as long as it was, because like, not only is it just giving you time to really like feel every location and like that connection to it, but also like, because in tone and execution, this isn't necessarily like other Batman films where, you know, it's more of an action kind of adventure sort of like whatever. It's more of, you know, the detective element is a bit more emphasized here, which is like, you know, obviously that would require a lot more time to do so. But also like, I've seen a decent amount of superhero films in the past, and even though this one is much longer than most of them, like this one has like the least amount of like, not filler because I don't like that word, but like, you know, just like in between stuff that doesn't add anything emotionally. Like, I think that's the biggest thing, is like, this is the most emotionally compelling Batman film to me, in the sense that there is that time, like, it doesn't fly by necessarily, like it still feels like it's length. It's not fucking Drive My Car where it's like, oh, it feels like 2 hours and 3 hours. It definitely feels like 3 hours, but all of it is very purposeful, and that time is necessary, I think.
I think that informs like the mood of the piece in a way that like Morgan was talking about, how in essence like this is a movie also about how the environment of Gotham sort of informs its characters. And I think that also lends credence to like directly to the characterization of basically everyone, because the thing we haven't really talked about thus far is that like we've talked about how Reeves really kind of wants to do the definitive like live action Batman, is that even still, he is not like, this doesn't imply that he is devoid of personal touches and stylism. The movie that aesthetically resembles this the most in terms of lighting, in terms of camera work, in terms of setting to me, is David Fincher's Seven. which, you know, you can talk about the mystery and all of the similarities that someone like the Riddler has to John Doe. But to me, the similarities come from the fact that you have a villain like the Riddler who you know, does all these horrible things, amazingly presented and stuff. I love the opening scene of the movie a lot. It's doing that like POV De Palma thing, and at first you're like, oh, it's Batman because he's got like binoculars and shit, and it's like, oh my god, it's fucking not Batman. And then he, you know, the shadowy thing, like all that's just mwah. But the cool thing about it is that it does, like, the setting in the Batman does what the setting in Seven does for that movie, in that it sort of lets you understand a villain who is like almost wholly just like detestable and evil, and you're just like, but I get it. Like, I understand why someone like, raised in this hellhole would do something like this, and I kind of understand it.
You eventually become amazed that everyone hasn't turned out like this.
Yeah,
considering the environment. And like, again, that is a direct reflection of Batman himself, even though he is on the moral high ground in every sense here. Like, how in the hell is everyone not taking fucking judo classes and just like trying to do something?
It's like, this is why there's so much fucking crime in Gotham. This is why it's like, it addresses the sort of like, even in the Nolan movies, when they kind of get into the more of the weeds of things, is that it's still very general, whereas you kind of understand the internal politics of this world just a tiny bit better. It's not like, you know, fucking The Wire or anything, you know, it's not Daredevil, but you still understand on a macro level everything that's happening and who holds all the cards and who sort of has influence here, and like all this kind of stuff, which sort of adds to the tangibility of the world and all that kind of junk. But what's cool about it is that, like, there's sort of that lack of, you know, fluff that Luke alluded to, where, you know, when we go in to meet the Penguin for the first time, we don't have a character sit there or the character himself sit there and explain to us who the fucking Penguin is. The environmental storytelling and the visual storytelling tell us who fucking Penguin is. It's like, we can tell by just the kind of person he is, the kinds of places that he is in, that he is a mid-tier crime boss who, you know, his face is fucked up, so he was probably some kind of like lackey at one point. And, you know, he's risen through the ranks, but he's, you know, he's got his eyes set on some further horizons. He wants to do more. He's just not given the opportunity because, you know, everything in Gotham is where it is because everyone wants it to be that way. That structural inequality is what it depends on. So when you have Batman come in and upset the structural inequality, you have people like him who are going to try and take advantage of it. You even have people like Catwoman, who decidedly are on the more high end of the moral spectrum, but they still only really look out for themselves. And I think that goes beautifully into something we haven't talked about yet, which is the Batman himself, Bruce Wayne, played fantastically by Robert Pattinson. I mean, I hate to sound like I'm a fucking, you know, preaching to the choir here, but this is head and shoulders my favorite live action Batman, because to be brutally honest with you, I don't really think any of the previous live action Batman have truly understood what it is to be Bruce Wayne and what it is to be Batman. I think Christian Bale's character is, you know, I'm calling him Christian Bale's character. I'm not calling him Bruce Wayne. I'm not calling him Batman. It's just that, you know, he's a Christopher Nolan protagonist. You know, he loses his woman in The Dark Knight, and then he does the justice thing because that's what the Christopher Nolan protagonist would do. And Michael Keaton is, honestly, I'm really not that into Michael Keaton at all on either the Batman or he kind of mumbles a lot, and that's just kind of his whole performance. And I'm like, I mean, he's a weirdo, but like, he's not a proper Batman weirdo. Whereas like the main criticism I've seen Rob get here is that he's like, there's not a lot of dimension to his performance. And I'm like, yeah, Batman is a dude who is antisocial. He lacks a personality. He doesn't have any friends. He's isolated. He's lonely, and he doesn't know how to do anything other than be fucking Batman. He has more personality when he's in the cowl and when he's talking to people. Everything he does is out of necessity, emotion. All of
say it. They say it in the movie. Riddler is like, when you put the mask on, that's who you really are. Like, what? They say it.
That's the
also
thing.
To add on to that, honestly, like the thing that I found sort of the most compelling like element just about Batman in this is like, you know, as with the past iterations of Batman, it's always kind of been like, you know, the billionaire element has sort of been emphasized a little bit more. Like I think Adam West and Michael Keaton Batman, I think, are kind of those things. And like, you know, like there's a bad thing that happens to him, but like there isn't much presentation of like how much this actually weighs down on him, like this like trauma of his past. Whereas here it's like, oh, you could fucking tell like this dude is just not fully there. And also I think that kind of gets to like the other thing that I find interesting is like, you know, all the other Batmans feel like, oh, I choose to be Batman because it's like I have a duty to like everyone and that sort of thing. Whereas this one, it's like I don't have any other option. Like I have to be Batman. It's it feels like a weight on his shoulder rather than like, oh, I have to do it for the sake of justice kind of thing.
Which is like, you know, that's kind of a bit like it almost baffles me that we've been making live action Batman movies for 30 years and everybody just kind of missed that part of the character where it's like nobody, especially if you're going to ground it in realism, nobody puts on a bat suit for the greater good, you know, like they do it because they're cracked up. Like, and
I just think of it like
their life means nothing, and if they don't make it mean something, they will die.
The best way I can describe it is like this Batman has like more in common with like fucking Anton Sugar than like a superhero, but like the morals are like better.
Travis Bickle.
I mean, fucking
yeah,
precisely.
exactly.
It's that's why that like it's the fact that no one has ever made that connection of it's just like, you know, Batman's a vigilante. It's like all of these things in past Batman movies have felt really external. Like you said, it's people's like choice to be Batman. And the thing is that what I've always found compelling about the character is that he doesn't choose to be Batman. He has to be Batman because he can't be anything else. The fact that like Christian Bale's incarnation of the character so fully puts on a performance as Bruce Wayne, and there's that whole struggle between like, am I Bruce Wayne, am I Batman? It's like that isn't what's interesting to me at all. It's like Robert Pattinson's Batman is a guy who physically and emotionally cannot make a performance as Bruce Wayne. He is incapable of it because he's that broken. He is unable, like people don't see him. Everybody's like, oh my God, that's Bruce Wayne. Everybody's like, holy shit. And that's the juice. That's the sauce of the character, is that like you see so much of him in this movie is him in the bat suit, and that's because he is Batman. That's the only time he's able to be any shade of a human being. And it's also why I think his chemistry with characters like Gordon and Catwoman is so amazingly captured, is that it's like, it's not a lot. It's not, you know, it's not like Marvel dialogue where it's like quippy and whatever, but like there's a lot of really underrated comedic moments that come from the fact that, you know, Batman, the fucking stone statue of a human being, is talking to the very down to earth performance of Jeffrey Wright, who's just kind of like
Thumb drive. Oh, this guy's hilarious.
It's so fucking like people say
it's
this
so
movie,
good, honestly.
people say this movie is humorless, and this is the state of movies right now, that like this is a movie that's presenting everything with like a super serious aesthetic lens, like everything's dark and stuff, and everything's, you know, it's a movie that looks like David Fincher movies, and then you have somebody make a pun about a thumb drive, and it's just
That's
like
because
it's funny.
Like,
Literally.
when people read a Philip Marlowe novel or something,
like appreciate like an ounce of absurdism, like a tiny itty bitty bit, or even when you have a villain like the Riddler, who like, again, people are sort of go after like Paul Dano of just kind of like, oh, he's so like crazy, and he does like that fucking, he does like those vocalizations when he's talking to Batman and he fails and he's all whiny and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, that's why are you not like totally taken aback by how great of an interpretation of the character that is? It's like making the Riddler a weird loby fucking anarchist dark web streamer who is also a serial killer and like kind of like a fucking like, he's like a dark web YouTuber, and he's just like, thanks for all the advice on explosives, guys. Like
that's so fucking funny.
It's so good, honestly.
I can't tell you what this community has come to mean to me in the recent.
Honestly, like the thing that's the best thing about it though is like it's so fucking like good and genuinely funny, but it never breaks the tone that's like set. It's never like like an MCU film where like something awful just like happened and then it's followed up with like that just happened.
It's
worse because the groundwork has been laid by this environment where it's like, yes, it's 7, but it's 7 with a like Gothic chapel with 15 flying buttresses. That was just another excuse for me to say flying buttress attached to it, because it's there's an inherent absurdism, like almost because it's never mentioned by anyone. It's like, that guy's in a fucking bat suit. Like,
yeah, like the most is like they'll say like, he's a vigilante, but no one ever says like this man literally has fucking insane. Bat ears. This dude's quirked up as fuck.
That is why whenever he walks and like all of the cops are always just like looking at him and they're just like, I cannot fucking believe Jim Gordon is letting that guy in here right now. And you get like what boggles the mind is that some people are just like, oh, this is so crazy. You need to be like completely grounded though. And I'm like, if you completely ground it, then you're just doing the Christopher Nolan thing again.
Well, I mean, like,
acknowledge the fact that this is a fucking comic book. This is how this is supposed to be. I don't understand what you guys want.
Well, no, I like, these people will bitch about how grounded the Nolan movies are, and then we get this, and then they just bitch. They just bitch and bitch and bitch, and they don't like movies. So fuck.
More macaroni, more cheese.
Well, that's the thing, is that at the end of the day is that it balances all of the things that make Batman believable and all of the things that make it fantastical. It doesn't compromise either side of this, which is definitely what the other incarnations had trouble doing. It's like, you know, you have a guy called the Penguin and it's just like, no, it's like, he's just kind of a guy who's a little fucked up. He does do a little waddle when he's tied up, which is like,
well, yeah, but it's because he's tied up.
Yeah. Colin Farrell, by the way, is so fucking good in this movie. I am so like, everybody was just like, oh, why don't you just cast somebody who looks like this instead of putting a bunch of prosthetics on it? It's because,
like, guys,
I'll
because
tell you
James
why.
Gandolfini's dead.
It's because Colin Farrell gets to be what? No la habla español?
Also, like, I think there's also something that's like kind of interesting in the way that they have like someone who obviously does not look like that make him look like that. Because like, I think, having just like a mob boss with like, prosthetic makeup to make him look like that is like, okay, whatever. But there's something like a weird uncanny feeling when I look at that dude. It's like, this dude's something's up with this guy.
Get when you look at a motherfucker named the Penguin, frankly.
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
But like that's the thing though about the people saying this movie's humorless. I'm going to talk about some of this movie's detractors for a second, and we're all entitled to our opinions. But okay, we'll start with the shortest one. Is that people are saying it? Certain people are saying it's poorly paced and too long. I don't even know how to explain why that's wrong. Like, cut any of these scenes out and the movie is worse. It's like the guy Reeves and the editing team had an extra year basically to slave over this, and it like everything here is on purpose, and DC and Warner Brothers let it fly. Partially that's because of the whole Snyder cut thing, and they're just afraid of like even the idea of a director not getting their way at this point, which cool. But like, it's because if you cut anything out here, the movie makes less sense. It's worse. It's less well drawn, well realized. So I reject your hypothesis.
Yeah, it's a perfect like clearing of the slate to present to you a world to build off of, and not in the way that's like, oh, we're gonna make this so we can make sequels. It's like, no. This is grounding everything so that we know the ins and outs of how all of this shit works. And I don't really like understand the notion of like, if anything, one of my only issues with the movie is that there are certain elements of it that I wanted to be fleshed out more. I wanted the relationship between Alfred and Bruce to maybe take a little bit more, a little bit more informed, just because whenever they do interact, there's so much that's unsaid in like a good way. mind you, that's like, you can tell that these two characters have a lot of history with each other, where it's like, Alfred isn't quite a father to him, but he's also not quite a mentor, but he's also not quite a friend. And there's a weird kind of relationship that they have where Alfred almost feels like he's enabling Bruce, but also is aware of the fact that he's enabling him because he doesn't know what else to do. And like, there's a really emotional beat that happens with them in like the middle of the movie that's like really affecting. It's one of the most emotional scenes that I've like witnessed in a Batman movie, that like legitimately really takes advantage of the fact that Serkis is a great actor, which, thank God. But it really like grounds their relationship. And I just kind of wanted a little bit more. I wouldn't mind if the movie was fucking 20 minutes longer, if it did it with like that express purpose, because it's paced so well that I just don't care. Like,
yeah. Like people saying this movie is humorless, like you're just not cracked up enough in the head to see it, guys. I don't know how to explain to you why Colin Farrell in a fat suit and 50 pounds of prosthetics waddling in hand and feet cuffs is funny. If you don't see why that is funny, you're watching the wrong movie. Stop going to Batman movies.
Or serial killer Paul Dano, who's genuinely intimidating, and in the second half of the movie, he's just like, "All right, guys, thanks for the advice about explosives." Yeah.
Can I say actually something about that, honestly? So there was, I forget like what moment it was, but it was a moment that was supposed to be like super, super scary, I think. But I think knowing this film, it also was sort of supposed to be slightly comedic, that made me laugh out loud in the theater. And like the two people that were sitting close to me gave me the stank eye in the middle of the screening. And I was like, I'm not taking that back. That was great.
I feel like we aren't giving Dano the credit he's due if we don't include some of the fact that there's intentional comedy there. It's like he's playing his character from fucking Prisoners if he was like a full-blown cognitive psychopath. And it's like there's an inherent scariness to that. But again, it's like the main villain of this franchise is called the fucking Joker. What do you expect from this kind of shit? And I also just, cards on the table, I think Paul Dano is terrific in this. I think that he has the same kind of magnetic quality that Tom Hardy as Bane had, where whenever he's, emoting with just his eyes and he's doing things behind a mask, is that he's just as compelling as he would be without the mask. And it's because like he has a weird kind of lanky physicality to the way he moves. Like when he kills somebody, you're just like, oh God, he fucking killed that guy. But he's also really awkward, and you know that he's not going to be able to withstand like a full-blown fight. So he has to resort to the mind games, and the way he's a presence that's felt over the vast majority of the movie, and like he only really kind of shows up at the end there, is like, this is one of the ideal ways to use a villain like the Riddler. I think it's the definitive incarnation of the character in a like medium like this that I've seen.
I think one of the things that could kind of be an issue if like trying to do the Riddler is that you're just doing the Joker 2.0.
Yeah.
But like the thing that I find really compelling about the Riddler is like how much he does get ahead of Batman, and it gets into his head. But like when the chips are down and like they actually do like interact face to face, he just kind of realized, no, this dude is just kind of just a mess. And he was just somehow able to get ahead of me. And then, like there's the whole like, oh, you're just like me thing, which, like most movies would have been like, yeah, sure, whatever. But like with this film, it's like, no,
it's like the moment when you're probably like a degree of separation away from him in all seriousness. It's one of the
and the fact that it serves as a wake-up call for Bruce, where it's just like, well, the part where he just destroys that dude's face, like turns him into fucking pepperoni after taking the fucking adrenaline or whatever, and the guy goes, I'm vengeance, and Bruce is like, oh fuck, I need to.
Are we
find...
the baddies?
Well, it displays something that like, there's always the problem that if you don't do a good enough job at characterizing Batman's villains, they do kind of all fall into the same category, and Riddler and Joker are definitely one of those things. But to me, one of my favorite parts about Batman the Animated Series is that Riddler and the Joker in that show kind of get the fuck on each other's nerves, because it's like, Riddler and Joker like do the same things, but they have entirely separate motivations. And the Joker is just like, he's literally just like, I just do shit. I just blow shit up. I just want to be chaotic. Riddler always has a
just
purpose.
a little guy running around.
He's just a dude who's like, he always wants something. Like, that's the difference, is that the Joker never really wants anything. He just loves to live in the moment. Whereas Riddler is just like, I am trying to do something. Which is really like an emotional part of this movie that I didn't really expect myself to get swept up in, is that it's just like, yeah, psychopath crazy, he kills people, but also it's just like the fact that he was one of, the orphans, and the fact that it does address the fact that, Bruce was incredibly privileged and had all of this money, and that's the only reason. It's like, he basically upfront makes the point of just like, the only difference between me and you is the fact that you're rich. And it's like, yeah, that's just an unassailably true thing. And it really brings home, like when Morgan said that, like when he kind of has that wake up call, when Bruce saves that kid, that's like one of the most like human moments I've seen in a Batman movie like this, that felt 100% earned. It's that, you come full circle and have him saving a kid, which, also goes back to the fact, Batman is saving the child version of himself. It's the motivation that he has to keep going. But it's also just because it's like, it goes to show you that just because this is like the most far gone version of Batman that's still Batman, but he still has a soul. He still has something that separates him from his villains. And that one thing is empathy and compassion. And he does help people at the very end. And that makes it feel like a superhero movie. Like, there's a lot of talk for the moral grayness, for painting things in shades of gray, which this movie does, but it still understands that at the end of the day, that Batman, no matter how far you push him, still needs to be a good guy. And having that sort of emphasis of like, that's like a real moment in the movie when he saves that kid and he sort of like, goes over it. It's just like the fact that that's made into something. It's so refreshing after so many years of DC movies that are just so wanton with collateral damage, and they're so unconcerned with the actual heroism. It's all about torture and all this internal shit, and it's like all of this imagery that's just so like dour. And it's like, I don't care if something is dour as long as you remember the heart at the end of it. And those movies just don't have the heart at the end of it to me, but this one does, because it knows just how much to include.
It's a problem that also plagues the MCU, because like, I can't remember the last time I watched an MCU hero save someone. Like,
we save the world.
Yeah, and like, that's fine.
Yeah,
it's a different thing, and that can be cool. And it's like, I don't fucking remember the Guardians of the Galaxy ever personally saving anyone, but those movies still own. So
Spider-Verse, that's another example.
Yeah, it's like another category of thing at this point, but that still means that scene is extraordinarily refreshing, as well as, like, again, without a word of dialogue necessary, able to communicate how well-defined Batman's arc is. And I think at this point I'm probably all talked out about this, so I'll finish by saying that I think this is the best live action Batman movie, because it is a movie in which Batman has a very strong, very well defined, very visually told in most cases arc as a character. There is a progression that he goes on here, and it's why Mask of the Phantasm is so great. It's why The Dark Knight is great. It's why Batman Begins is great, is because they all, for all of the bells and whistles and alternate takes on the character that they may embody, they remember, even if your interpretation of Batman doesn't necessarily resemble 100% the sort of the source of what Batman is, there has to be a really strong and well-defined arc. And I think even of Batman Begins of the Dark Knight, this one has easily, far and away, the strongest and most well communicated,
most coherent.
Yeah, and it feels very strongly in line with Batman as a character. That's something I remarked upon in my second letterbox write-up for this, where it's like, it feels funny to say that it feels like we haven't had a Batman movie in years, but we kind of haven't. Like, that's why it kind of baffles me when people are like, oh, another Batman movie. Like, basically, dude took the 2010s off.
Yeah.
Like, there were Dark Knight Rises closed that thing out, and that's such a like complicated, disparate version of that character that it may as well not even factor in.
It's really 2005 was the last time we got a true, honest to God Batman movie.
Yeah, in live action anyway.
Yeah, live action.
And like, Zack Snyder is just doing whatever the fuck he was doing. So it feels like for the first time in ages that we have a Batman movie. And not only is that so refreshing and revitalizing in terms of cinematic explorations of this character, it feels like this is far and away the strongest one for someone who's been, just from the perspective of someone who's been following this character for longer than he can remember.
It's what the Daredevil TV show was to me. It's the same level of excited that I felt about that, where it's like, not only is this just the definitive version of this on all fronts, and it's like as good as I could possibly expect something like it to be, something where I would barely change anything at all, is that it creates a world of possibilities. It doesn't just start and end with this movie. The cool thing about it, and that like news has just come through today, is that there's going to be a TV show that's going to be based around like the Gotham, like, crime shit with like the Penguin and stuff, and even some stuff with like Arkham Asylum. And this movie is getting sequels. It just broke 300 million in like 3 days. So, I mean, that's woof. But that's the cool thing, is that there's a world of possibilities, and I'm not immediately like exhausted with it. I'm not like, oh God, more. I'm just like, no, it's like, there's potential here. There's so much that they can play with. There's so many different villains and stuff. Like, there's an illusion that I know Morgan and I lost my shit, or our collective shits about, because they reference a character with the last name Elliot, who could possibly be related to that of Tommy Elliot, aka Hush, aka the best Batman villain who's never actually had a proper movie. I don't count the animated one that came out last year because nobody liked it or saw it. But that said, it's just like, Reeves is a dude who's like enough of a Batman fan to even know who Hush is. So that to me tells me everything I need to know of just like, there's so much more that can be done here, especially because this is intentionally like Batman Year 2. This is like at the beginning of his tenure as a superhero. And like, as long as Rob is willing to come back and be Batman, my ass is in the theater, because this is a movie that, like, technically speaking, is basically faultless. Like, the camera work here, the editing, everything about the way this looks, everything about the way it sounds. Oh God, Michael Giacchino. Oh God, the theme music in this is so fucking good, dude. Like, just the best Batman theme, which is not an easy claim to have. I mean, like, Hans Zimmer and Danny Elfman both have made some fucking excellent music for Batman, but this is my favorite just because it feels as like grand and operatic and dark and brooding as you want something like this. Burton's Batman theme is a little bit too, Danny Elfman, Tim Burton-y kind of, like, oh yeah, this is a Danny Elfman score. And, Hans Zimmer is still kind of, there's a lot of bois and bohems and brrs.
Similar to, 3-hour epics. This feels like Howard Shore's Fellowship score, where you're just like, oh, this dude just cooked up like hours worth of music for this. And like, it's almost a story in of itself. We've talked about how strong the sort of noir detective aspects of the film are, and I 100% agree. But part of what makes this movie feel like a fucking miracle is that it nails the superhero action shit 2, like the final set piece in Gotham Square.
Dope.
Oh my god. Just like the I don't know, 45 seconds to a minute of him tearing ass through the iceberg lounge, just throwing a bat into a dude's face, a baseball bat, not a bat. He did not throw a bat at someone. And like, it's all perfectly clear in the edit. Like, everything connects. It all has weight. I can see everything. And it's not just in that sense where like I saw Shang-Chi last year and I was like, oh, they finally hit the bare minimum. Like, this shit is just legitimately like excellent in terms of like choreography and actual filming of hand-to-hand combat.
Might I add a fight scene in a club that I can actually like not want to die while watching it.
Yeah,
Yes.
what a concept. Like a seizure.
Yeah.
What a concept.
And like, dudes, my guy Matt Reeves was just like, all right, I'm making Morgan's Batman movie. Apparently, this is what I am only left to extrapolate from having seen the film. Like, what can I do to add just a little like the whipped cream and cherry on top of this perfect Batman Sunday? Oh, I know, I can do a Friedkin French Connection to Live and Die in LA fucking car chase in the Batmobile about halfway through. And I may have blacked out the first time. So I'm glad I saw it the second time. I may have blacked out because I'm like, oh my God, he did it.
Oh, it's so one thing we haven't shouted out that we have to, just because this is us and just because the person in question deserves it. But not only does this have my favorite Batman, I also think Turturro is very good in it, but he's almost good because he's the most normal. Like, he's just being John Turturro crime boss, which is like, yes, good, that's what I want. But Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman is like, every time she's on screen, like, I mean, the meme on Twitter this week has literally just been like, Zoe Kravitz came on screen and a girl moaned, and it's like, like, she is so, like, her entire, like, her attitude, her movements, like the physicality of her performance is perfect.
But it's also like, there's never a moment where I'm just like, that's Zoe Kravitz.
Yeah.
Like, every time she's on screen in the full Catwoman regalia or not, I'm just like, oh, that's just Selena Kyle. That's just that's cat burglar.
Her overt sexuality offsets Rob's, like, it's not that there's like a lack of sex, there's like an amazing amount of sexual chemistry between the two, but it's like, I feel like if you made one of those tables that's just like knows what sex is, has had sex, it's just like, Rob knows but hasn't had it, and he's just like standing there and she's just like giving you the fuck me eyes, and he's just like, what is a bra? I don't know.
He's like, I haven't been in a room with a woman.
Does it involve vengeance?
Since 1998.
Just like, will having sex with you save the city? Because I mean, like, I'll do it then.
Like, I kind of like, because like, that's
Yep.
You got a lot of cats.
And then she looks at him and it's just like,
Yeah. It's like, I am waiting for the pussy joke.
Just like, and then it never comes because he has the emotional like experience of a fucking 11-year-old.
I am not convinced Alfred had to talk with him. I'm like,
no.
Maybe that's why he's so full of regret. He's just like, Master Wayne, see, when an emotionally stable man and an emotionally stable woman.
Literally the worst billionaire at being a billionaire.
Well, I think that about rounds it out for our experience on the Batman. We're pretty big fans of it, all things considered, and I think that
say that
it's I think at the end of the day, it's our personal baggage to the Batman character that leads to our affinity for this and finding it so refreshing. But even just from the standpoint of being someone who cares about film and popular art, is that this very clearly communicates something important to me, which is that like the person behind the wheel of these movies matters. And in many respects, Zack Snyder is almost the sort of at the forefront of that, because that's sort of the first time in popular culture that people really attributed any kind of sort of auteur theory in any kind of popular cinema as a whole, which, you can have whatever thoughts you have about auteur theory, but I do think it's a good thing that we have acknowledged the fact that people who are passionate about the material and people who have proven themselves to be worthy of said material making these movies is important and yields success, because it communicates to people higher up on the ladder that like, this is what we need to do to green light these movies. We don't need to just get Joe Everyman. We don't need to get the fucking director of Children of the Corn 666 to make the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I didn't make that up. That's actually what happened. But like we're closer to moving away from that, and that's a great thing.
To sort of like round out sort of like my thoughts also on the film is like a lot of what you added on there, very much I second that as well. And just the visual elements are so good. It's so good to see a Batman film with shadows, with actual shadows and like darkness in it. Like, holy shit.
Like where
what a
where you're not like,
concept.
I can't fucking see, like that fucking Batfleck scene of him in Batman v Superman driving around was going around on Twitter. And I was looking at it.
Oh
and I'm
my
like,
god.
I can't fucking
Like,
see.
It's the fucking Phantom Menace effect, where it's just like, this isn't a place.
Yeah.
Nobody's
like,
actually at a place right now.
Basically, it's like getting Greig Fraser as like DP on this was like such a great move, because like low light cinematography is like his shit, and this is probably his masterpiece in my opinion. And also just like so much of the like character stuff that you mentioned is so good. And I think like especially like what you were talking about with like that moment of becoming like not a vigilante but a hero is like really important, because like I won't say like what happens at the end of this, but like the note that this kind of film ends on is probably like the bleakest of like most of the Batman films, but it's also the most hopeful at the same time, which is like genuinely such a beautiful beat to do. And also like probably like one of my favorite needle drop usages in a film, with fucking
dropping Nirvana to Batman movie is so fucking amazing.
Yeah.
It's just
it's and I'm very glad that it was actually in the movie. It was not just a trailer thing, because like twice. But both times have so much purpose. And I will say, and I will end this off with a joke that one of my friends on Letterboxd made, and said that this is basically just Paul Schrader's Batman, and not because someone blows up in it.
Although someone blows up in it.
Yeah, it's true. I just thought about that.
It is worthy to point that out. Someone does blow up in it.
I think it's great that you mentioned that it's sort of like it's the bleakest but also the most hopeful. It's because it shows there's a lack of compromise here, which is wonderful to see. And I also I haven't been able to like fully get this out of my system yet, but casting Barry Keoghan as the Joker.
There's like Wired, and there's Inspired, and then there's fucking whatever that is.
You're hired for the Batman 2. All right. Rock over London. Rock on Chicago. Clue. It's not just a game anymore.